Hi, welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. I'm Charlene Jorgensen, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to unfold one more quilting design with you today. We're going to be working with the fan design today. This is not a new design. In fact, it's been around for many years. I have a couple of examples that I'd like to share with you before we start cutting the blocks today. In the first quilt, I have chosen to use playful oriental fabrics. Because there are so many colors in the fans and there's such a variety of print, I decided to unfold them on a gold background. Each of the fans share the same purple in the points, and you'll notice that there is a feather design quilted separating the fan blocks. The meandering feathers are surrounded with a stippling stitch, which makes the feathers stand out very nicely. In this quilt, I have decided to arrange the fans in a square formation, and on the outside corners I have used partial rows to create the square corners. I have used a tiny accent of red first for the inside border, and then I used a wider border using a large floral print, also an oriental fabric. The person that machine quilted this quilt for me chose to outline the large flowers in this design and then filled in the rest of the area with a stippling stitch. And she did a very nice job in this outside border because the flowers stand out so nicely when she surrounded them with the stippling stitch. The next design that I want to share with you has a totally different mood than the first one, mostly because of the fabric that I decided to use in it. You'll notice also that each of the blades in the fans have two fabrics in them, and it created an accordion look to them. Again, I have placed them on a dark background, creating a square in the center, and then filled out the corners with fans sitting on point. Each of the blocks in the center of the quilt are separated with a playful bow, and I've used a magenta thread to quilt the bows in. That made them stand out more and actually added to the quilt itself. On the outside edge of the quilt, we have a large border, first of all on the outside edge, and then on the inner border I have used a narrow pink strip of fabric. The fans in the outside border are connected together with a flowing ribbon, and also I have stitched those again in a magenta thread, making them stand out more. Actually, I chose the width of the border for the outside edge after I designed the quilting design that I used in it. Well, now that you've seen the examples, it's time to get started quilting, cutting and sewing the pieces together. I'm going to use a collection of reproduction prints from the 30s to cut the quilt today, and if you take a look at them, you'll see that there's quite a variety of prints to pick from. Actually, it's going to appear as if it's a scrap quilt when it's finished. Then for the background behind the fans, I have decided to use a plain green, and then the pie shape in the corners, I'm going to use a yellow. Before starting to cut your quilt out, take the time to pre-wash all of your fabric with a soap that doesn't have any bleaching additives in it. And then, of course, rinse it well, dry it in the automatic dryer, and then take the time to iron it so that the fabric lays nice and flat when you're starting to cut. Ahead of time, to make it go faster, I have pre-folded some fabrics in half, and then I have lined up the folded edge out here, one on top of each other, and I'm going to straighten all of them at the same time. You just line the edge of the ruler up down here with the folded edge of the fabric. I like to cut all of my quilts out with a rotary cutter because I feel that I have more precision when I do that. The cutter comes in a couple of sizes, and I prefer to use the smaller one. There's a couple of ways that you can hold the cutter. Some people like to grab onto the cutter like this, and I prefer to use my cutter in this way, resting my pointer finger up on top. When starting to cut, I release the blade by just gently pushing forward with my thumb and then placing the cutter down along the edge of the ruler. Now ahead of time I put fabric grips on the bottom side of my ruler so that it's not going to slide when I'm cutting. And with my left hand I hold the ruler in place and then just run the cutter along the edge of the ruler. In one straight cut I have straightened all of the fabrics at one time. Now when you're in your sewing room, make sure that you have plenty of room to turn your board as you're cutting. You don't want to work yourself into a tight little corner. Place the pattern shape that you're going to cut. First of all, we're going to cut the blades that go into the fan. And let me show you how the pattern shapes relate to the design that we're working on. There basically are only 3 pattern shapes that make up the whole block. First of all, the blade, which goes in here, and there are 7 of them in each of the blocks. We also have the little piece down here in the corner. I call it the pie shape. And then, of course, the outside piece up here. So it is just 3 pieces then that we have to work with. And we will end up with an 8-inch finished square when we're done. Now when cutting the strips for the blades, place the template up on top of the ruler and you'll see how much fabric you need. And this time we're going to cut the strips only 5.5 inches wide. After you have lined up the ruler, then release the blade and again follow the edge of the ruler, cutting all of the fabrics at one time. Then after I have cut the strips off, I want to move those cut strips up onto a smaller mat board because it's easier to work on. And you can cut on either side of the board. It doesn't matter which side you're working on. And bifold the strips up on top of the board so that it's easy to turn it when you want to. Place the template up on top of the strips and cut around it again with the rotary cutter. The accuracy is so much better than if you were to place or to trace around them with a pencil and then try to cut them with a scissor. Again, just follow the edge of the template and turn the small mat board as you're cutting around the pieces. Now each time I'm cutting I have 7 blades. And I won't take the time to cut any more of these, but you would just simply flip-flop the template, working your way completely across that set of strips until you have the number of pieces that you want. The next piece that we're going to cut is the corner piece that comes up here in the block. And for that one, we're going to cut 8.5 inch strips because remember we have a 8-inch finished square. And when cutting these strips, I need to use a larger square ruler because the small one isn't wide enough to accommodate the shape. And I have folded the fabric into 4ths this time when I'm cutting this piece out. First matching up the selvage edges and then pulling the folded edge over. We will straighten the edge of this fabric by matching up the folded edge out here, releasing the blade. Each time you're done using the cutter, you make sure that you close the blade so that you don't cut yourself. Then turn the board, leaving the fabric up on top to ride along when you're turning it. Now move the ruler over until you have exactly 8.5 inches. And we will be cutting now 4 of the backgrounds each time we do this. After you have completed the cut, then turn your fabric and place it up on top of a smaller mat board. That makes it easier to handle it when you're cutting. I'm going to place the background piece now up on top of there. Actually, I guess I've decided that it is too small to work up on top. We'll work on the larger piece, I guess, or the larger mat board. Place the pattern shape up on top of the cut strip, and notice how I have lined up this edge over here and the bottom edge down here. and turn the mat board so that it's easy to follow the curve when you're cutting. Now when I get up to this part of the template, I need to stop cutting so that I can flip-flop the template and get 4 more out of this area up here. Just follow the edge of the template, and notice that I have the grips on the back of the template to keep it from sliding. Remove that part and turn the mat board so that you can get at the cut over here easily. There, now you have 4 of the background pieces, and like I said, just repeat that on the other part of the fabric that's left over. I do it this way so that I don't waste any fabric when I'm cutting out the background pieces, and I won't take the time to cut it, but you just line up the edge over here again, cut the curve here, and trim off the edge out here, and you get 8 of these pieces each time you go through this process. Now the only piece that we haven't cut for the fan design is the little pie-shaped piece that fits in the corner. And to save time ahead of airing, I have cut a strip of fabric for the corner piece and cut it a little bit wider actually than the template that I'm going to use, because it has a curve on it and I want to be able to trim off any of the extra fabric when I'm working around the curve. Now I've folded it, like I said, in half, and I match up the edge of the template out here with the cut edge of the strip. And I'm going to be cutting 4 of these each time and making it possible to turn as I cut around the template when I have it up on the smaller board. Then you would flip the template in the other direction, and I would match the curves up like this, actually pushing this one into this area, and that way I won't waste very much fabric. Well, that's all it is to cutting the pieces out. And if you aren't able to start sewing right away after you're done cutting, I find it very helpful to have something to store all the cut pieces in. And then when you're ready to start arranging them on your flannel board, you just have pull them out of there. Before I take you to the sewing machine, I want to go through a few of the sewing steps ahead of starting. Even though it is a scrap quilt, I do take the time to arrange all of the pieces on a flannel board, because you don't want 2 blue or 2 pink next to each other in the scrap quilts. Then after you have done that, you chain sew them together and you end up with a fan like this. And I'm going to turn it over so that you can see how I've ironed the back side. Notice how I've ironed them all in one direction. And that's a very important process in this particular design, and when we get to the sewing machine, you'll understand why. Then after those are ironed, then we will connect the corner piece down in here, and I'm going to turn that over so that you can see how I've ironed that. See how I've ironed it towards the pie-shaped piece. Then the only other part left to do is to add the background up in here, and again that particular seam was ironed towards the outside edge of the curve or towards the background. Well, let's go to the sewing machine now and go over a few of the tips that I was talking about earlier. We will be sewing all of the seams today with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I like to use cotton thread because it matches the fabric not only for care but for strength. I also like to use an open toe foot on my sewing machine because it has no bridge that would obstruct the view in front of the needle when I'm sewing. And I sew with 10 to 12 stitches per inch when I sew. The first thing that we will do will be to chain sew the pieces together using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I say scant 1/4 inch seam allowance because you need to make up for the amount of fabric that's used up in the seam line. And when sewing these pieces together, I like to start on the narrow end of the piece and then work towards the wider end. Also, when I start out, I like to hold on to the fabric behind the presser foot so that it doesn't go down into the feed dogs. I will not backstitch when I start out sewing this seam. and because this seam will be sewn over again later when we add the pie shape in the corner. Notice also that I haven't used any pins to hold the pieces together when I was sewing this seam. They only get in the way when you're doing something like this. And you would just continue chain sewing the pieces together, again putting them right sides together and starting at the narrow end and going to the wide end. Sometimes one little tip that I find real helpful, if you don't like to pin pieces together like I don't like to do, I find that the pieces will bond together nicely if you iron them with the iron first. And if you don't have the luxury of having an attached ironing board next to you, then you might find it helpful to have one of these portable ironing boards and place it on a tablecloth or on a card table or something next to you. Now that I have ironed those pieces to each other, they seem to fuse together, and it's easier actually to control them at the sewing machine. Just running the foot along the outside edge of the blades, and like I said, about 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Again, I did not backstitch at the end of the seam because that only creates bulk in the corners when you complete the rest of the quilt. Then after you have chain sewed all the pieces together, you'll sew them together into a complete fan. And I won't be completing the fan at the machine, but like I said earlier, you iron all of the seams in one direction. And I find it helpful when I'm ironing that I first finger press the seams to one side before going to the ironing board, and that will help eliminate some of those wells in the seam line that you might have if you don't do that. Then after you have made the complete fan and pressed it in one direction, you start adding the little corner pieces down in here. And you need to find the center of that piece by folding it in half and cutting a tiny notch. And don't cut it so deep that it goes into the seam line. Just deep enough so that you have a little bit of a mark there to identify the center. Then place it right sides together with the fan that you've made. Now we're going to sew with the fan on top, so I'll want to turn it over, and we'll first insert a pin right in the center, and then we'll put another pin on each end out here. So first one in the center and then one out here, and that kind of holds it in place, and then move the fabric into a match using one or two more pins in the center. You should not have to stretch either of these to fit each other. It should lay right in there. If you have to stretch one or the other, then your seam allowance is not correct. And repeat the process on the other end. First put the one over here on the end, and then a couple more in the center. Right here, and then one more over here. Now when I sew this seam, I said I want to have this on the top, and it looks like I have an awful lot of bulk in here, but if you take your time, it goes in very nicely. And I will use a tool called a stiletto, and I punch the bubbles out of the fabric as I'm sewing along. I will leave the fabric behind there. I won't cut the thread because it saves thread. Not only that, but it's easier to start out. And just before I come to the pin, take the time to pull it out, and then use the stiletto to guide your fabric in front of the needle. And each time you come to a pin, take the time to pull them out. When doing curves like this, I find that using a stiletto is so helpful, and it gives me a lot more control. Actually, I don't know that I could do a curve like this without it anymore. Just taking your time to sew along the curve, guiding it, and punching out the little bubbles with the tool. I like to use silk pins too when I'm piecing like this, because they have a tiny shaft in them, and if you do choose to sew over them once in a while, it doesn't seem to be a problem. Now I won't take the time to press this seam, but you do press it towards the pie-shaped piece out in here. And I would finger press it first. Like I said, it eliminates any of the problems as far as having a well in the seam line. The next piece then that we need to add is the corner background piece. And you would do the same process, folding it in half to identify the center and cutting a small notch to mark the center, and then matching the notch of that with the center of the fan. And this time we're going to sew with the background piece on top instead of the fan on top. And this is when you realize how important it was to sew this, or to iron the seam line in that direction, because you won't have to be fighting against the seam lines. And I won't take the time to sew that, but you do it just like you would the pie-shaped piece down in the corner. You would first pin up here, then at each end, and a couple more in the center, and taking your time to follow the curve, using the stiletto then to guide your fabric as you're sewing. And showing you the back side of that block, this is what it would look like. Notice how I've pressed the seam allowance towards the background piece, and it lays nice and flat. Now the quilt that I have in front of me is a different arrangement of the fan block. It's different from the ones that I showed you in the beginning of the program. Notice how the fans all point in the same direction, and this is probably the one that most of you are familiar with. When sewing the rows together, of course, after you have the blocks sewn, then you arrange them the way you want them to go, and you sew them together into rows. And when doing that, I have chosen to iron those seam allowances open, because I don't like all the bulk in the corner. And when pinning those together, you match up the seam line of each of the seams, first by stabbing a pin right on the seam line 1/4 of an inch from the edge on both the top and the bottom, and then putting another pin on both sides of that. And then after you have those pins inserted, you remove the standing pin, and you would repeat that on each of the seam lines, and then just sew across there. And again, you would iron the seams open. And that's all it is to putting the fan blocks together. And the size of this quilt is simply determined by the number of blocks that you sew together. I have one more variation that I'd like to show you how to cut before I'm done today, and that was the accordion one that I showed you in the beginning of the program. When cutting the blades for this quilt, you need to first pre-sew strips of fabric together. I have done that ahead of time, and also I have ironed the seams open, and that eliminates all of the bulk in the blades when I put them together a little later. There's something that I want to explain to you about how the blocks go together, so that you're conscious of it when cutting out the blades for your quilt. Notice that when I have a continuation of the flow of the fan, that I have an alternate color every other one. And sometimes in a design like this, I choose to flip-flop the direction of the block, and that's how I created the square on point in the quilt that I showed you at the beginning of the program. And so to eliminate something like this from happening, you need to change the direction in which you cut the blades out. To find the center of the blade ahead of time, I laid it on top of a ruler, and then I scored a line with a stiletto right down the center of the template. And when cutting out the blades, you line up the template, the scored line of the template, with the seam line on the sewn strips. Now you can only cut one of these at a time, because it would be impossible to line up the seam lines if you stack them on top of each other. And I use a small mat board so that it's easy to turn the board as I work my way around the pieces. And like I said, you can only cut one of these at a time. And when you do your accordion quilt like this, make sure that you are conscious of the direction in which you have the fan going. Now notice how that one matches that direction. Now when I cut the next one going in the other direction, you want to make sure that the template is laying in this direction, and that will make the turn in the blade when you want to change the direction. The rest of the cutting and sewing instructions are the same as all of the other ones that we've gone over with the Aunt Grace's collection of fabric. I hope you've enjoyed watching the fans go together today.